Deaths of despair. This is a report that I'm working on with faculty at Minnesota State Mankato. A little background, what are the diseases and deaths of despair? In 2009, up to that point, the mortality rate for Americans, you can see on the slide, it was declining steadily. And then the trend reversed rather abruptly there. And in 2015, there was a landmark study by a couple of researchers where they coined the diseases and deaths of despair. And this was when they noticed that there was an alarming increase in deaths from suicide, drug poisoning, including accidental overdose, and alcohol-related diseases. And so you can see from this chart where things are going in Minnesota. It's been, those three things have been rising steadily. This is the death rate per 100,000 population. And you can see that, especially in the last couple of years, in 2020, 2021, alcohol and drugs, drug deaths have just been going off the chart right there. And those are the diseases of what are called the diseases and deaths of despair, because these are the things that are associated with people who are just suffering from depression, anxiety. They feel they have no hope. And so they turn to these things looking for a way out. And so the suicide rate in Minnesota, you can see on the right there, has been rising steadily since 2000. The lighter green line on top is men. The line below is women. Men tend to have a higher suicide rate compared to women. And women often attempt more, but men tend to be more successful in their attempts. But the suicide rate among women can vary depending on race, can vary quite a bit. And research is ongoing, but social media appears to be a factor in this. You get the issue of comparison, people, talking about what you need to do to lose weight or look just right or have the right car or have the right job or the right income, things like that. And people looking at basically unattainable things online that they feel like, I can never have that, so, what's the point? And that causes a lot of stress. Minnesota has decided on a number of groups of the population that they call their populations of concern. And those are youth aged 10 to 24, Native Americans, Black and African Americans, middle-aged men, LGBTQ community, veterans, and people with disabilities. These are groups that have higher than average suicide rates. And you can see on the right there, this is the Native American or American Indians and Alaskan Natives as the census delineates that group. The lighter green columns and the trend line there are in Minnesota. The darker green line is the US trend line for the same group. And you can see that Minnesota's trend line is quite a bit higher than in the US. And so that is definitely something of concern that they're looking into. And then farmers. We know that farmers struggle with unique issues, the burden of losing the farm or not carrying on the legacy, volatility of markets and their income. Older farmers, this is important, that doesn't get really talked about in the larger audience. Mm-hmm. But older farmers, when they lose a spouse, they sink into depression. Younger farmers, when they have relationship problems or divorce, it's depressing for them. And in the case of divorce, the family business is at stake, because that's the farm. And so there's that whole issue of legacy around that. Then with farmers, as with rural populations in general, there's a higher rate of stigma around mental illness and the idea of going and seeking help. And then you have the longer distances that you have to travel just to get mental health care in rural areas, and the smaller number of providers that we have in rural areas. And so you have many more people per provider than you do in an urban area. And then also just watching the farm community dwindle is very hard on farmers too. So where does the despair come from? We talked about that with farmers, but for the population in general, there's something called the social determinants of health. This is kind of a sociological health science. determination of things that make people, that can depress people, be hard on their emotions and their psyche. So high economic insecurity, that is not knowing where your next paycheck is coming from, or not knowing if you'll be able to pay your rent or buy food. Being unemployed or out of the labor force, occupational losses, especially in the manufacturing industries. We talk about the Rust Belt states, that's a real issue there. Social isolation and loneliness is a big issue. We talk about how we are now the most connected society in the world ever, in world history, and also the loneliest. And then a perception of worsening local status. And then this one that seemed to pop up quite a bit, living in rural. And so I had to dig into that one and see, is living in rural a social determinant of health, or what's really going on there? But I just wanted to add too that social determinants of health is kind of another term for trauma. Trauma in people's lives, whether it's losing a job or something worse happening, being bullied, being abused as a child, things like that, working in a toxic work environment. These are all traumas, and these things add up in people's lives. And so not having those things addressed through life can lead to things like depression and anxiety. And that's what researchers are really starting to understand now, is the role of trauma. Oh, living in rural. And so is living in rural a risk factor? Here was a quote from one study: economic conditions, lower education levels, working in jobs with high insecurity, and being unemployed and living in rural areas appear to be the most relevant social determinants of health, impacting the rates of deaths of despair. And so you can see on the chart, I used the same population density measures that Kelly used, those RUCA groups of counties. And you can see that sure enough, in entirely rural areas, the suicide rate is higher in those areas compared to entirely urban areas, including the metro area. The one on the far right is entirely urban Twin Cities, and then next to it is entirely urban Greater Minnesota. And so you can see how it kind of goes down as you get more dense population. And so here's another chart showing the same thing with trend lines. You can see that in entirely rural counties, the suicide rate is rising faster and is higher already than it is. So you think, oh wow, living in a rural area does increase your risk for suicide. Well, not exactly. This is basically saying the same thing, but this is by region. And I want to point out Northeast and Northwest are quite high compared to the 7-county metro area. And so is being in rural, does that lead you to want to, take your own life? Well, no. It's a factor of, or it's a combination of factors that occur at a higher amount in rural areas. So we have a larger Native American population in rural areas. And we saw already how high the suicide rate is among Native Americans. More economic and or financial insecurity in rural areas. Traditionally, we have had lower paying jobs, although that's changing, but there's also a lot of seasonal work, less, stable jobs and things like that. Less access to healthcare services, especially mental health care services. That's a big deal. In a report we did last year on the mental health workforce, we found that the number of providers the number of residents per provider in rural areas was about 6 to 8 times higher than it was in the metro area. Fewer employers offering health insurance, that's a big factor. More jobs in industries involving physical and manual labor, which leads to more injury and chronic pain, and then less access to effective health care like physical therapy. So that chronic pain is a big issue too, especially with the opioid epidemic that we've had, and opioid pills being prescribed. And it was, you didn't have alternatives to your therapy. Social stigma around seeking help is a big issue. And then access to firearms. However you feel about firearms, there is more access to firearms in rural areas. More people have firearms and guns, and so that is the method of choice, more so in rural areas. And so let's talk a little about the 988 suicide call line. So here's the data that we got from the state, which they got from the organization that operates the 988 suicide line. And this was the call volume per 100,000 population, 2018 to 2023. And so each of those bars in there is a year. And so you can see how the usage has been going up in each of the regions, except entirely rural. That stayed relatively flat. But it's been going up, especially in 2023. That's the projected usage because this was only through June 30th. But you can see that there was much more usage in the Twin Cities. Now, part of this does have to do with promoting the 988 usage when they first changed it to 988. They didn't promote it as heavily in Greater Minnesota because they didn't have call centers in Greater Minnesota. And they wanted people in Greater Minnesota to be able to talk to people who understand Greater Minnesota. And so they didn't promote it quite as much because they didn't want to be overwhelmed, for one thing, and they also wanted rural people to be able to talk to other rural people. And so that's a kind of an ongoing thing. But one thing to note too about 988 calls is that this data doesn't show calls that are made from out-of-state cell phone numbers. They're routed to the state that the area code is from. So say, for instance, that you've been living in Iowa, but you moved to Minnesota 20 years ago and you still have the same Iowa phone number. You would get sent to a call center in Iowa. That's okay. It's still, these are still perfectly, competent people. They know what they're doing. Veterans, Native Americans, and Spanish-speaking callers are also routed to counselors who are just dedicated to them. And there is also now, besides the phone number, you can text and do chat with 988 too, which is a big improvement, especially for younger generations that really like the texting. Usage by population density. This is looking at the usage and at the suicides. And so it's probably not a fair comparison, but it is interesting to see the kind of the balance between the two. The least usage is in entirely rural Minnesota. The highest suicide rate is in entirely rural Minnesota. And you can see how it goes up with usage by population density and the rate goes down by population density. And so this is a lot of what the state is working on with their suicide prevention program, where they are providing grants and technical assistance to communities who are setting up their suicide prevention infrastructure. These will be things like counseling, mental health counseling organizations, and things like that, to really get into communities or build them organically within the community to help with suicide, give people the help they need to access. And then suicide by region. I just wanted to point out Northeast Minnesota in both. Northeast has the highest suicide rate in Minnesota. We're going to be digging into that more to see if we can find out what's going on, talk to people who are up there. You can see the low usage of the 988 number in Northeast Minnesota. And then wanted to point out in the 7-county metro area too, where it's just the opposite. And then here's a quote that I just read actually in a book. "We're a crowd animal, a highly gregarious, communicative species, but the culture and the age and all the fear that fills our days have put almost everyone into little boxes, each of us all alone." This was actually written 30 years ago in 1995. And you just think, what has changed? And is it time to change things? And so what do we do? Well, we'll have our full report available in March. We'll be doing a webinar at that time. And I wanted to point out, we talked about the negative social determinants of health. There are also the positive social determinants of health. So if you have unstable income as a negative social determinant, stable and increasing income is a positive social determinant. Better access to health care, stable housing, better social connections, and less isolation. And these compound just the way that trauma and negative social determinants compound. So when you start compounding your positive social determinants, things start getting better and people start getting better. And that is our preview of what we're doing.
I want to ask a question about Minnesota State University Mankato, and they have a brand new Center of Rural Behavioral Health. Would you want to talk about that briefly? That was part of a study we did last year.
Yes. We worked with them on our study looking at workforce in mental health care. And the Center for Rural Behavioral Health was started just a couple of years ago at Minnesota State Mankato. And they're really almost unique in the nation in that they are looking at issues of mental health specifically from the rural perspective. Those issues that are unique in rural areas, where if you're looking at data on, say, a statewide basis, or you're doing a random sample but not paying attention to the randomizing and getting a good representation by population density, urban respondents and urban data tends to just overwhelm everybody. And so it may look like things are going okay, but when you start parsing the data and pulling things apart and separating them, you'll see that things can be quite different in urban areas than from rural areas. And so that's really what they're looking into, is what are these unique issues and how can we help? And the big thing that we looked at with our report that they're also looking at is how to increase the number of mental health workers and mental health providers in rural areas to fill that gap. And some of it has to do with people being able to afford school, afford that education, get through it without having massive student loans waiting for them on the other end. Because they get through school, but once they get through school, they then have to go through an internship, which is also, if they get paid, is very low paying. And but they still have to pay their student loans because they've graduated. And so that's a loophole that needs to be looked at. And then there is the problem of a low number of internships. There may be enough internships for students in urban areas, but not in rural areas. And part of that is of the problem is the expense for the provider that's going to provide the internship. They don't get paid for those internship hours because they're not necessarily providing a service. And so those are some of the issues. Also just attracting providers to rural areas. It's one of the reasons we need to have internships in rural areas. And that's because students who have their internships in a particular place tend to stay there.
Right.
And so they become familiar with the place, they grow to like the place, and then they end up staying there. And so those are all things that the Center for Rural Behavioral Health is going to be looking at, and that and more.
Yes, absolutely. And like I said, it's Minnesota State University Mankato, so you can go on the website and do a search for rural behavioral health. We do have a question on how do we access the report being presented in March?
Well, like I said, we'll be doing the webinar, but then we will have our report. We'll post it, like all our reports, on our website at ruralmn.org. You can see on the screen there. And you can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter.
Yeah, so you can go to our website, ruralmn.org, and sign up for our newsletter, and you will be the first to know when the report is out and when we have the webinar up. Most of our research reports, we do have a webinar. We also do a blog post, a podcast, potentially a video. It depends. We try to get as much information out in different ways possible. So go to our website, sign up for that information as well. Would you also want to talk about the report after that coming out?
Yes, then there is another report following this one. That is access to mental health services for children and youth in rural Minnesota. And that is an even bigger issue than access for adults.
Sure.
Because of the history of the way we pay for health care and things that have happened in the mental health care field and laws over the last 50 years. Mental health services, especially for people who need more intensive services, and especially for children, have really been kind of hamstrung. And so new things are happening, but there is still a big question about our child is having an episode, what do we do? And it's just not well known and well understood. And so we're going to be doing that. We're going to be looking at what the types of services are and how much they're available and where. And we'll also be looking at what the barriers are to getting more of these services and getting more services for greater Minnesota.
Right. So more like an environmental scan
Right.
of resources. That's fantastic. And the thing to know too is a lot of our research is breaking open a topic. And we're hoping to go more in depth on our topics as well.